Welcome back to this episode of the Tech for Climate Action podcast. I'm delighted to talk about something a little bit different today. This is Hydrostor, a Canadian company, a really innovative company to do with energy storage. I'm delighted to have John Norman, who is the president of Hydrostor. So first of all, John, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Ralph. I always love talking about the electrical grid and how it's evolving.
So tell us, first of all, a little bit about Hydrostor. Why is it so special?
So we are an innovative large-scale power storage company. So what does that mean? It means you can think about trying to use big batteries on the grid to store electricity and put that on the grid when it needs it. You know, one of the things about the electrical sector, I've worked in it about 25 years now, I guess. Storage has always been called the holy grail of electricity in a lot of different ways, in part because it's really the only commodity where you have to meet supply and demand every millisecond, and you can't store any inventory. And historically, that's been the case, and it makes it very expensive, very challenging to meet people's needs. That's why there's so many hard decisions to make. You either need to have way too much generation available at all times, some of it polluting, some of it causing other problems with development. And that's just to meet peak loads. And so storage is really, really key, because then you can take, when you have excess electricity, say from wind or solar, if you know the wind is blowing hard and the sun is shining a lot, store that and then put it on the grid when it's needed. So as far as Hydrostor is concerned, I mean, there's been efforts for decades and decades to come up with ways of storing electricity that's cost effective. And it just, until very recently, it really hasn't been cost effective. The first shift was sort of with batteries. People started using batteries and EVs and on our electronic devices. And so that brought the cost of batteries down, lithium ion batteries, and that allowed it to be used on the grid. But it has limitations, and we can talk more about those limitations. There's been a lot of entities like Hydrostor out there working to create different types of storage on the grid. And we use compressed air. I'll explain that a bit more as we continue our discussion. But where the idea came from was one founder worked for a nuclear plant, big nuclear plant here in Ontario called Bruce Nuclear. And the other founder was a guy in the oil and gas sector in Alberta. And the Bruce nuclear plant, because you can't store electricity, you can't turn off nuclear. You know, like you can't ramp it down. It's really hard to do. So what do you do with that excess electricity? Like, it actually costs tons of money. So they were trying to figure out, how can we store this on a large scale? And they looked at pumped hydro, a whole bunch of like batteries. Is there ways of doing this? And that's where Curtis, the founder from the nuclear plant, met Cam Lewis, who is in this oil and gas sector. And he really came up with this idea of kind of taking air compressors in their latest form and storing energy and being able to put that back through the grid through a turbine with a whole bunch of different innovative pieces. And really what Hydrostor is actually is just a really simple integration of oil and gas supply chain equipment and mining technology that's lumped together to create this large scale storage asset for the grid that I'm happy to explain further. But that's kind of where Hydrostor came from. And we're based here in Toronto. We have about 120 people overall in the company. We're backed by Goldman Sachs, as well as the Canada Pension Plan. And our focus is really global, because we're looking at very large scale applications, and Canada is kind of a small market for us. So we kind of are in Toronto as kind of our home base that we grew out of, but our application is across the world.
There's something to dig into there as well about your client base, but just talking about the technology first. So I think a lot of us are familiar with battery storage at home. If you've got a solar array, for example, you'll have potentially Powerwalls or similar batteries in your garage, as you would say, garage, as I would say. Also regenerative charging as well on your EV. But this is kind of much bigger scale, isn't it? This is certainly from your website, I was reading about 500 megawatts. And I wanted to get a sense of what that actually means. How many homes is 500 megawatts worth of electricity, first of all?
To give you an idea of the scale, that is about enough power to power 400,000 homes. So, about a city the size of Austin. To give you another idea, we have like an advanced project in California, and we received full grid deliverability. It's about 12% of the total capacity that was available in California at that time. It's a critical reliability asset to connect to the grid. So it's very large scale infrastructure in our case.
We're also entering a period now. I mean, there's a lot of renewables in Europe where I'm based. There's also been some interesting things happening, which I'm not, maybe you know more than I do, but we're not entirely sure what happened in Spain recently, for instance, where the whole grid went down. So trains stopped working, people couldn't get home, lights went out. I mean, it was across most of the major cities, and it wasn't for a few minutes either. It was for quite a while. So the renewable side, this kind of energy that is based on the weather at some level, that is transient, that isn't necessarily matching the load that you need at that moment, potentially a bit more of an issue than I think. I mean, I guess you always knew about this with your background,
Yeah.
but I think for a lot of us, it was like, oh, but renewables are great, aren't they? But this is a slightly different issue. This is about keeping the grid in a state that it can power everything that needs the power and not have these huge fluctuations, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. I mean, the interesting thing about storage is it's really a bipartisan issue. So I realize there wasn't necessarily a political lean to your question, but it is interesting that sometimes we talk about decarbonization or energy transition, and then there's the kind of political labels attached to those things. Whereas the way I would look at energy transition is it would have been happening around the world, certainly the developed world, around this time period, independent of a decarbonization agenda. So, for example, any conventional power infrastructure, like most of it was built in the 80s, maybe early 90s, 70s, and it's hitting the end of life. And so we would have been going through an energy transition under any circumstance and wouldn't necessarily just be using technologies of the past. What's sort of interesting about renewables is that initially there probably was a bit of a political push around it, and there was certainly decarbonization benefits around it. But solar and wind have really become like one of the cheapest forms of energy that any economist would look at. If you're just putting energy on the grid, it's by far the cheapest way of doing that. The challenge, as you point out, is it's only going to be working when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. So that kind of highlights the need for storage. And storage in general has been built out across the grid quite a bit, actually, in different parts of the world. The question is sort of like, what is the duration of continuous discharge that's required on the grid? And it's like to date, it's been pretty short, but increasingly it's getting longer and longer and longer. And that's causing a whole bunch of push for technologies that can actually provide longer and longer duration storage and help meet these large periods of demand where, the sun isn't there, but the demand is increased. Some of your listeners may have heard of a quote unquote duck curve, which is talked about a lot, which is just means there's a huge amount of solar generation that puts the needs during the middle of the day really, really low. But then all of a sudden, when the sun goes down and everybody's getting home, there's a huge ramp up. And you just don't even have enough resources conventionally on the grid to meet that massive ramping requirement. If you can sort of picture that, that's where these kinds of solutions become really critical. And as you say, it's about reliability. So what we're finding mostly around the world is it's very bipartisan. Australia has gone through a whole bunch of different left to right to left leadership. They've all remained committed even to renewables because they're cheap, and then to storage because of the reliability needs. And I think you'll find similar things across North America and Europe as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you make, that we're growing at such a rate. I was at an event in DC recently, which we covered, where they were talking about AI and data centers and then energy as well. So it was those folks that were in the room all together. And there was a big push at this event as well. Nuclear should be the answer, build new nuclear power stations. The same is happening here in the UK. there are two big nuclear power stations being built, which have been given the go ahead. I started my career in nuclear, and then here they pulled out of nuclear because it wasn't green and it wasn't seen as the way forward. So you do need different solutions. And by the way, I'm not saying that nuclear shouldn't be a part of it. It should. But it's been interesting that we, certainly in the UK, lost 35 years, potentially 30,
Right.
35 years of progress and innovation because we just stopped. And now we want back in. So
Definitely. Yeah.
it's an interesting point you make about needing different technologies.
100%. And all of these technologies have a place. I'm sitting here in Toronto, which is Ontario, Canada is one of the largest nuclear jurisdictions in the world. 50% of the power here is generated from nuclear. And, what's interesting about that too, we were just talking about longer duration energy storage. Well, you would think, oh, there's lots of nuclear, there's some renewables, there's some gas on the system here. It's a pretty clean grid, actually. Why would they need storage? They need storage because the nuclear, you can't, like when you have excess nuclear generation, they still have needs for capacity at peak times. What better way to do that than through long duration energy storage to take that excess energy? Otherwise, you'll be trying to dump it elsewhere on the grid. And so there's so many different use cases. And, even the polarization around natural gas there is a transitional need for that. And certainly we see an increasing shift to long duration storage, which, gas is really a form of storage, stored energy, and you burn it and it gives you energy. And as we're migrating to these other types of resources like ours, then there's certain areas where gas is needed. One of the neat things about our technology is that we're this very large scale compressed air plant. So we're sort of taking off-peak electricity, we're running it through a compressor, we're storing that air pressure underground, and then running it through a turbine to generate electricity. But what's cool about that is it's very similar to how a natural gas plant runs. It's just using air. And a lot of these gas plants, a lot of these coal plants are retiring around the world just because of that end of life issue we were talking about before. And we can flexibly locate where they're needed because we actually build our cavities out of hard rock. And that's how we store the air. And we're just deploying these techniques that they use in the mining and hydrocarbon storage industry to build out these caverns. So that gives us flexible siting. We don't have to use any gas to generate heat because you do need heat to go into the turbine. We're just taking that heat from our compressor. It's generating heat. We've proven this whole process. We have an operating asset that's contracted to the grid operator here in Ontario. And we have advanced projects that we're starting to build out or will be starting construction soon on, actually, in California and in Australia, which are very large scale. They've got the scale we were just talking about before and are really critical to those grid needs. In fact, they're all different use cases, which is sort of interesting. But to go back to your original point, we need all of these solutions. And ours isn't, the magic holy grail in and of itself. It's an important piece of the overall solution set that's going to be required. And we need to get on with it because, the scale of transition that's happening, it's really fast and our institutions need to catch up.
Yeah, certainly the rise of AI is quite scary the past couple of years. I also read on your website some of the statistics about jobs created as well, which interestingly, the politics, certainly in the Western world, it's always been important creating jobs, but now I think it's more and more important with the uncertainty in the economy. So, you have some figures there around these sites. You're creating, it's not just tens of jobs, it's kind of hundreds, if not thousands, isn't it?
Yeah, we are a very significant infrastructure project. Our technology is called Advanced Compressed Air Energy Storage, or CASE, Advanced CASE for short. And every time we're building an advanced CASE plant, there's about, a 4 or 5 year construction period. There's about 6,500 total jobs, like high paying construction jobs created during that period of construction. And then there's 40 to 50 ongoing operating jobs that are really high skilled operating major power plant type jobs. In fact, what's sort of interesting about our technology, as opposed to say batteries or even wind or solar, which are often manufactured products coming from overseas, is most of what we're doing, the bulk of it, 75% say, is kind of infrastructure that we're building in the ground in whatever jurisdiction that is. And each project at that scale is $1 to $2 billion. So very significant investment that goes way beyond those jobs, right? And a lot of that, unlike it going overseas to buy a whole bunch of battery cells or something like that, it's invested directly in the economy locally. What's kind of neat about the direct jobs too is these really are the same jobs that, and someone who operates a natural gas power plant or a coal power plant, these are the same jobs. We're not just retraining them to say clean solar panels or have some maintenance of wind turbines and these sorts of things. It's the direct analogy to their jobs, but just part of the cleaner energy future or part of that energy transition.
Just tell us a bit more about the technology. So in really simple speak, when there is excess power on the grid, that's powering the turbine one way or storing the air. And then when we need it, you kind of reverse the process and bring it back out. Or is it more than that?
No, it really is that simple. It's just obviously the devil's in the details a little bit. Compressed air energy storage has actually existed for a very long time. So there are very large scale plants that have been operating since the 80s and 70s in Alabama and in Germany. It works really well. We're actually just built on the exact same basis. The reason you didn't see a lot of compressed air storage built out in that intervening period, though, was there's a couple of limitations. So one is you need a really large storage volume to do it that way. So you can't really build these cavities out for the traditional compressed air approach. You can only really do it where there's salt cavern infrastructure already existing. So that isn't often located on the grid where you need it on the grid. So that's one limitation. Probably the bigger limitation is just you do need a heat source to go into that turbine when you're taking the pressurized air and running it through the turbine. So historically, what they did was burn natural gas for that purpose. Works really, really well. Technically, we can do that too. The challenge with doing that, though, is you kind of have a slightly more efficient gas plant with all this storage infrastructure and limitations on siting, which means you just build a big gas plant, like a big traditional gas plant. That's typically what happens. So it didn't really make economic sense. What we do and why we're called Hydrostor is we actually just use water to compensate for the air pressure. Now, we didn't invent this technique. It's called hydrostatic compensation. It's used in the butane, propane, gas storage industry. But without going into all the details of it, what it allows for is a much, much more space efficient storage of the same amount of a gas. In our case, it's just air and water. So we can, if we're at the right scale, this 500 megawatt scale, we can build out these caverns using traditional techniques in that storage, in the hydrocarbon storage industry, and just build it out of hard rock. And that's what allows us to flexibly site. Doesn't mean we can site anywhere. It does mean that about a third to a half of landmass is usually suitable. So that's a lot of application in any given jurisdiction. In fact, you mentioned the UK. That's an important development jurisdiction for us because they're experiencing all these issues. They have long duration storage needs. They have concerns about gas post-Ukraine. There's all kinds of stuff happening, but we can site really all over the UK, the East Midlands, up in parts of Scotland, down in the Southwest. There's other parts we can't, but those areas provide such value to the grid that the amount of compressed air storage you could put on the system there is really significant. And that tends to be consistent across all sort of jurisdictions in the world. The thing that actually drives our investment is more, what is the grid need for long duration energy storage in that jurisdiction? Because not all grids are there yet. Some have different reasons. Usually what's driving it is a combination of energy demand. You mentioned AI earlier. That can be a big part of it, but just electrification, growth in population. There's a whole bunch of reasons why grids are still growing. Really critically, the demand is growing, but all the conventional generating resources are retiring. So there's a huge need for electrical capacity. And particularly if you're in a jurisdiction that has really good renewable resources like California, or challenges siting traditional, like a new natural gas plant or something like that, like the UK or California, That's where energy storage becomes really, really critical and very cost effective. And so we just look for jurisdictions that recognize that, and they have mechanisms in place that allow us to get infrastructure financing. So in other words, they'll set a clear target and say, hey, we need 2,000 megawatts of 8-hour storage. That's what New South Wales did in Australia, or 1,000 megawatts of 8-hour storage in California. And we can go out, compete against other resources like pumped hydro generation or batteries. And we've been winning contracts. And that allows us to build and develop and go through all these stages of permitting and all these other things. But usually the advantage of advanced case is just that we kind of operate like a gas plant without the gas. We can flexibly site. We're quite cost effective for that large scale storage, and we're much easier to permit, say, than a pumped hydro storage plant, which is much, much larger volume requirements, much, much greater infrastructure requirements. In fact, California is not an easy permitting jurisdiction. We've been quite supported in our project that's nearing construction there. Throughout the permitting process, there's been very little controversy, and environmental NGOs have actually been quite supportive of our approach to this energy storage, whereas they've been much more concerned about pumped hydro. So there's a lot of, pumped hydro is needed too, but it just has limited particular niche applications in certain areas, whereas this can be much more broadly applied as well.
I mean, that's quite interesting. Also, I think the permitting that you said, a lot of people that listen to this podcast are policymakers, particularly in Europe and the US. So what kind of issues have you had with the regulatory frameworks, and what would your message be to policymakers listening to this?
Yeah, a few actually. Permitting is an interesting one. It's important not just for our technology. It's really anything that we need built out on the grid. We need social license. I mean, that's really what permitting is for. And in a lot of jurisdictions where there's big grid build out needs, like the UK, like in Australia, there's a lot of talk about this social license piece. And how do we make sure that we're not sort of steamrolling over permitting, but we're getting community input, but we're not having that as a basis to block all forms of development. And so there's a balancing act. That's where a different mix of technologies properly cited, we try to avoid areas where we could generate any concerns, right? And that's really critical for anyone. So the permitting regimes are important. Do they need big fixes? They probably need some tweaking to operate more efficiently. And you don't want to just obviate the permitting system. However, are they fully efficient? Not necessarily, right? Like it depends where you are, and could it be done more efficiently? Probably. One of the bigger issues for us, though, is really more on the commercial side. It's more the economic regulation of the power sector that has limitations. And so really the regulatory system in electricity has been built up over the decades. It's mostly been a brake on development because any utility is incented through its rate base to just keep adding new assets on. So they come forward with their plans, the regulator has hearings, they shoot it down, right? And it's like that's their entire institutional purpose. Whereas we're in a very new stage where it's like we actually need to incent development. and the institutions, quite frankly, haven't really been set up in a way to do that. And it's been challenging. I could probably spend an hour talking about all the different examples of this, but I would say in general, what's sort of happened is governments and policymakers, where they're succeeding, have typically intervened. And and often they've intervened, to be quite frank, because their power market is in a crisis. So California, just like massive, there's outages, they don't have enough supply. Like, how are we making sure that happens? Or sometimes states are intervening and saying, well, hey, PJM, the big grid operator in Eastern US, largest grid operator in the world. Well, you guys are great at managing all these natural gas power plants, but you're not bringing on new capacity. So we're starting to get worried as states because we're responsible for reliability on our system. And you're not meeting our environmental objectives or a host of other objectives. And so they'll go out and try to say, hey, we're going to incent development in this particular area to make that happen. I will say, as a developer, like whether it's advanced case or just really any power infrastructure, those kinds of signals are really important. It can't just be built out on the market alone. This has been a debate in the UK as well, which has a fairly sophisticated market. And sometimes I find the markets that have sophisticated markets more frustrating because they're so close to it working, but it still doesn't work. It doesn't where you cannot get infrastructure financed. And so we almost have to simplify. We just need to simplify. Like we need to let planning lead markets, not markets lead planning. So let's plan long term to allow longer term infrastructure, including ours, but also pumped hydro, nuclear, a whole bunch of other things, to have a clear signal that they can then bring debt financing, equity financing to, right? Otherwise, states are going to have to take over this whole thing. It's like trillions and trillions of dollars. Like we clearly want to leverage the private sector as well. So how do we do that? Just simplify, set targets, remove regulatory barriers. We've set up one of the first non-wires alternatives in Australia. And that just means using storage as an alternative to transmission. But transmission is a regulated asset. So how does that get paid for? We've created an entirely new pathway in Australia for that. It's something that actually should be emulated throughout the world as well. So these sorts of regulatory barriers are probably the biggest issue, but are starting to be addressed in lots of different markets, including where you're sitting and where I'm sitting. But other areas haven't sent those signals yet.
I mean, I sat through some of the public planning inquiries, particularly for solar in the UK. And you're right, the regulatory or permitting side, which we don't use the phrase permitting, but permitting has been simplified or is being simplified. There's been various laws that have been brought through. So the sort of environmental challenges or the opportunities to challenge what's going on are reduced. And the idea is that they can speed up pushing these things through. But there doesn't seem to be a joined up agenda. Now that again, I'm trying to stay away from being political. I can see that there is a need to improve and future-proof the grid, because certainly here it's not future-proof. You know, it takes far too long to connect anything to the grid. They're talking about 10 years plus at the moment if you did have permission, which is crazy for the things that are happening. But at the same time, there'll be a lot of people who are saying, well, the environmental concerns are valid. You know, you shouldn't just concrete the countryside, which is one of the phrases used here. You should have an idea of what you're doing. And I think what appeals to me about what you've been talking about, and you mentioned the good old East Midlands in the UK, which doesn't normally make it onto anybody's agenda, but that's where I'm from originally, is that we already have space in the ground in several places where we could put this technology. It doesn't need to concrete over farmers' fields. And it's something that actually adds a lot of benefit no matter how the electricity was generated. I think the other thing that's popped into my head as well, listening to you and other people, is that, you know, 1 megawatt hour or 1 kilowatt hour of energy doesn't cost the same, whether it's solar, wind, nuclear, gas, or anything else. You know, there is a cost to a lot of these technologies, and particularly nuclear is probably the most expensive. So it's a fascinating engineering kind of jigsaw problem, isn't it? That, as Senator Dane said, who's one of the senators that was at our DC event, he said, it's cool to be in energy again. I kind of think it is, isn't it?
Oh, it very much is. I mean, that's why I'm a water resources engineer by background. I do have a master's in economics. Like, really, I've become a power market economist, which is why sometimes when I'm feeling pretty chippy in certain jurisdictions, I'll just be explaining, look, I think the economists have taken over the asylum on the market design and how infrastructure projects get financed. So you're absolutely right on that front. You know, megawatt hours, they're not, I mean, they're fungible in terms of the actual product, but they're definitely not the same thing. So these all come with different costs. And it gets even more complicated because, and you know, not only is there cost per megawatt hour, then there's kind of, well, wait a second, what's the additional requirement? Not all megawatt hours were created equal. So a solar and wind megawatt hour is not dispatchable. And that has different value than, even nuclear is not dispatchable, but it's base load, which is a different kind of value. But like dispatchable megawatt hours, which is what gas and coal have historically provided, have been the backbone of the grid. And now it's more storage that's providing dispatchable megawatt hours or other types of innovations and integrating the grid together in a way that's much more creative and able to use smart grid technologies and so on to make that integration more efficient. But that's an entirely different way of thinking. And one of the areas why we fit in a certain area, and we sort of say there's lots of types of different resources that are going to be required. You'll often hear, I'm sure you talked about on your podcast sometimes, just the need for decentralized generation, like to move into, well, if people are using electricity in their home, like let them generate electricity in their home, maybe store electricity in their home. And to some extent, that's happening. However, I think we also need to remember, like, even if that was fully cost effective, which it isn't for all applications, so you got to keep in mind the limitation, but even if it was, you wouldn't strand the multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure that is around the world for centralized generation. You'd want to take advantage of that. And that's what we do. Like, we're sort of the large scale, clean, like, generation and storage asset that can fit in those areas where there's huge amounts of transmission going to, say, like in the East Midlands, where there used to be coal power plants and so on. Take advantage of that, but make it part of the cleaner energy future and make sure it's future proof. So even if it is a political calculation, like, do we want to decarbonize or not? If you build a new natural gas plant now, like, even if there's policies to try and encourage that, who's investing in it? How certain are they about, where this thing's going to be in 25 years? Is that really a future proofed asset? Right? You need to be careful. And that goes back to the financing thing. So there just needs to be more planning. We just need to plan our systems rationally and say, we need a bit of this, need a bit of this. Here's how we expect it to evolve over time, and then adapt and have a cycle that allows that to happen, which ironically is kind of how every other form of infrastructure is built out. We could do that in the power markets more effectively as well.
So looking at the construction projects that you've got, you were talking about California, Canada, and now Australia. I suppose how are they going? What was the business case, if you like, the challenge that they were facing, and then how is sort of the other side of it looking? The success, you've solved a few issues for them. Just tell us a little bit about those projects.
Yeah, well, really critical for us is our project that's in Goderich in Ontario. It's about 2.5 hours outside of Toronto. And that's a 2 megawatt plant. It's smaller scale. It is contracted to the grid operator here. It's been operating since 2020. So that's a really important project for us because what it shows is how we use the heat from the compressor, we store it, how that will generate electrons for the grid, how that will function with all these market signals and everything else. And it's proven that performance really well. And what that allows us to do is get financing, performance insurance for all of our even larger scale assets that we're building out. Now, the large scale assets take a long time to develop. And in some cases, we were ahead of the markets. So we were part of the development of long duration energy storage policy in California and in New South Wales and Australia, as an example, very early on. And we've participated in their procurement process. They set these targets we talked about. We've won some of the largest energy storage contracts in the world in those jurisdictions. And we've been plowing through with the permitting or consent process, as you call it in the UK, and getting our interconnection capability, which is challenging in those jurisdictions as well. And they're really interesting use cases. So California is kind of a case where we're nearing financial close on this project. We're just lining up our last pieces of offtake, as they call it. So the electrons that we're sort of selling from the system to particular utilities. And once that's in place, we'll be looking to start construction as early as January next year. And that is about a 4 or 5 year construction project. Again, it has all those benefits we've talked about, but it's a 500 megawatt, 8-hour plant. And we can provide longer discharge durations onto the grid. It's just most markets haven't called for that yet. We're starting to see that evolve. Even in California, they put a signal out recently for 12 hours. And it could get longer and longer. So we may actually even add on duration to our systems. We can add duration post COD. So we're going to see how that plays out. But this 500 megawatt, 8-hour plus asset is very similar to our pipeline across the world. So the projects in the East Midlands we talked about. We have a project in Ontario where we're starting the development work now. And Ontario's coming out with a long duration storage program. Similarly, in New York, we have a couple of projects to hit their long duration need. Much more of these programs are coming out in Australia, and even places that haven't really defined yet. They haven't said, oh, we need X amount of long duration storage, like Arizona, because they have such a huge solar resource intraday. So, like storage that's like 8 to 24 hours is really valuable for them because it allows them to take all that powerful solar in that air in the desert and store it and put it on the grid where they need it. So just economically, it makes a ton of sense for them. So those projects in California and Australia is really going to be our next one. And it's a really neat application because it's located in a part of the Australian grid where Mad Max was filmed. Actually, it's the exact same location. It's called the town of Broken Hill. There's tons of wind generation and solar generation around there, and the town's big. It's like 25,000 people. It's actually one of the first. It's what BHP is named after, Broken Hill Parity or proprietary. And so there's a giant mine there that's still operating. It's the longest operating mine in the world, and there's a long transmission line, like many hundreds of kilometers, that serves it, that is not always reliable because it can get knocked down. And so what happens is most of the time we're using the mine infrastructure. We're a bit smaller scale there because of that line. So it's about 200 megawatts, and we're using some existing underground infrastructure, so it's more cost effective. But we sell services onto the electricity market most of the time. But when that line goes down, we always leave an amount of storage in reserve. And then the grid operator there creates a mini grid, right, with all that renewable generation that gets stored in our storage project. So it can serve the grid during that intervening period while the line is being repaired or whatever the outage reason is being addressed. So that's why it's one of the first non-wires alternatives, definitely the first in Australia, one of the first in the world that is sort of operating that way, but it's a really critical proof point for other projects as well. So we're going to see more of those in our pipeline. But not only that, other forms of energy storage are probably going to take advantage of those regulatory precedents too. So those are really important projects for us. And the Broken Hill project, which we call Silver City Energy Storage, that will be starting construction at the beginning of 2026.
Oh, well, it'd be interesting to talk to you in a couple of years' time and see how that's gone. I mean, the final question for you. So looking ahead 5 to 10 years, I mean, there's a push here, and also I should say in the European Union, because I spend a lot of time in Brussels and I have a lot of interest in that market. There's a push for kind of all types of particularly renewable energy at the moment, or clean energy. But there's also talk about things like small scale nuclear reactors, for instance, in the UK. That's a Rolls-Royce contract. I haven't quite got to the bottom of whether I should be scared yet or not of the idea of having that in my neighborhood. But it's kind of right at the bleeding edge of innovation. Where do you think the innovation is in the next 5 to 10 years? Because we've talked about some of the challenges, and it seems to be your technology. You almost don't mind, do you, what the energy generation is? You're there to store it. But where do you see some of the innovation happening? Because we seem to be at a pinch point at the moment.
Yeah, it's a great question. So we're definitely part of the innovative space in that this is a first of a kind integration. What's kind of interesting is, sometimes our private equity investors are sort of like, well, we wish you could be more innovative. It's sort of like, try financing a major power project. Like, we're trying to remove the levels of innovation we require and make sure it's proven. And that's why we're advancing quite quickly. There's a number of other entities that are coming up with all kinds of creative ways to provide long duration storage that's going to be needed. So there's a lot of innovation happening there, whether it's flow batteries, there's other gravity techniques, there's other mechanical technologies like ours, but using different gases like CO2. They all have their pros and cons. Some of them are more realistic than others, but there's always cost. Can you hit a particular cost target? Are you going to be competitive? And then are you going to be able to deliver and finance it? it can be really challenging just innovating in the infrastructure space. Like when you think about most innovation, even on the grid, it's been in smart grid, IT technologies that help you get better visibility on the grid. These are all things that pay back quickly and in the grand scheme of things are fairly low risk and scale
Mm.
relatively easily. Whereas true innovation in infrastructure is tough. It requires a lot of perseverance. Like we've had to, spend many, many years creating this pathway and showing that technology integrates together and being able to fund that while we're getting to our large scale projects. So there's a whole bunch of innovative technologies out there. And to your point on energy generation as well. So small modular reactors, like the small nuclear plants, there's a whole bunch of companies that claim they have a really good mousetrap for how to do it. Now, what's interesting about that to me is I really wish for everyone to be successful here. Like, we're not definitely not trying to take over the world. I entered into this because I want to help deal with the energy transition and deal with climate change and decarbonization. And we need more solutions, not less. And there really is no shortage of innovative ideas. The real question, even for the media community, is how to tease that out to sort of say, hey, these are near-term applicability, these are midterm and should have like a good pathway towards it. These are much more research scale. There's things they need to figure out. All of these things are important. I think we just need to be honest about where we respectively are in that cycle and make sure it gets different forms of policy support in each case so that we can get to that point. So I do think there are genuinely like very good ideas out there, and there are some that you'll probably see fall away over time because, like, I'm not going to name particular technology, but like when we crunch the math, we sort of say, I don't know how you're going to hit like this point where you're going to need to be competitive in these sorts of things, but others have a lot of potential. And so I do think it's really important. However, that innovation is really challenging for large infrastructure. So you really do need to persevere. And what we found as well is you need a really good team, right? Like we could talk about innovation in just like companies and institutions. Like for us, it's been really investing in the team and making sure that that's always the right people and adapting, because you can't, like, if you get stuck, you need to adapt to your changing circumstance. And that's kind of the key. It's almost like adaptive flexibility that you need to succeed. And I think that's probably true of any of these innovation companies in the power space.
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of training and skills. I mean, to my point earlier in our conversation, we lost a lot of those skills in the UK, myself included, because the jobs weren't there. We left
Yeah.
the nuclear industry. I went into telecoms, for example.
Hmm.
So it's about retraining as well. But John, I could talk to you for hours. I think it's fascinating. I'd love to see where you get to in a couple of years' time, particularly when that Australian project is up and running. But for now, I'd just like to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. And I'm happy to come back when we see that Silver City project putting its first electrons on the grid. So thanks again for your time.